Here are some pictures from the Western Day held at the Entoyment Game Store in Poole. The day consists of 2 games per player and each one against a different opponent, using the Peter Pig Western rules. Here's a picture of the setup of the Cattlemen on the right. This is their initial dispositions. You can see Cattlemen 3 groups there: foot group, mounted group. This is looking across the table. The mounted troops on the left and to the rear are the initial setup of the gunmen. You can see the various bits of terrain. There's a 5x3 table. This is showing a setup in a completely different game. Here's a small group of gunmen positioned in the defence piece in the church. There's only a few bases in the group, that's all that was left after initial losses. In the distance you can see a group of cavalry who are moving up, and the buildings in the foreground should make a good defence for those. Here are some initial deployments of some cattlemen groups. This is a group of raw mounted cattlemen. The little doggies is just a little tag to show they are raw quality. On this initial deployment, in the square to their left or above in this picture, is another raw group, hence the little doggy marker, and these ones are foot with long shooters. The cacti just denote partial cover. Here's a group or unit of gunmen positioned on a low, gentle hill. You can see there are 8 bases, one's a leader, the other 7 are mounted. They're all long shooters. From this position they've got a good line of fire, although shooting whilst mounted is not very effective. And this is at the early part of the game. Although a little blurred, here's a layout of a complete force of US cavalry, with some dismounted troopers and mounted troopers. The tokens you see, the little round coins with men kneeling on them, they're wounded. So when a base gets hit, it's replaced with a wounded marker, some which recover, some don't. So that's a cavalry force in use on the Western Day. Here's an open table with the scenery set up in the distance, ready for deployment. This is actually a townsfolk force. You can see about 4 groups or 4 units. There's about 6 units to this force. They're not very good quality, but there's a lot of them. And you can see various buildings grouped ready for deployment. Here is a group of cattlemen dismounted, armed with long shooters. This player's base his figures on 2 per coin. They look rather nice. The figure in the distance is the leader of the group. The near item is actually what's called a liability, something that needs looking after or can be lost. And the mat is a tiny War Games Western mat. Here are some Plains Indians from a Plains Indian force. I think they're Sioux, but they are quite small anyway. Now these are deployed in a grid, and it looks like there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's about 6 bases to this small group. They're Plains Indians, and of course these are 50mm. These ones are Peter Pig figures. This seems to be evidence of a major fight on a hill. You can just see in the top right hand corner, that's a force commander, the overall commander, called Kicking Horse. He's got some braves with him, and by the deads on the floor, or the woundeds on the floor, look like those were mainly cavalry or gunmen, I can't tell which. The Indians have got just 1 casualty base. Obviously the fight went their way, and they're upon a low hill. Here's an interesting view of a complete force of townsfolk. There's a lot of figures in it because they're very poor quality. A lot of them are armed with short shooters. The big group of figures on the left are actually wounded markers, they're not fighting figures. Once again, this player has chosen to put 2 figures per coin base, but the rules work by the bases, not individual measurements. And there's some various buildings there. Now this is interesting, a sequence of 2 photographs. This photograph shows a group of cattlemen in the distance and a group of gunmen in the foreground. The gunmen have just charged the cattlemen. Of course, both sides counter still charging, one side doesn't be assumed to be stationary. Now it's quite a good fight, and the next shot you'll see the outcome of this. So the gunmen in the foreground, cattlemen in the background, all mounted on a gentle rise. Now, this is a bit of a disaster. The gunmen are still in the foreground. The cattlemen have had the most appalling luck one can imagine. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cattlemen casualties there. Only the cattlemen group leader is still alive. So it really is bad news, but it was a catastrophic fight. The gunmen did a lot of damage. Of particular interest here, there's some 3D printed Western buildings in 15mm. They're quite nice, but as I say, the 3D printing, they come in several pieces. There's 2 cavalry groups, with the look of it, in the distance. And another townsfolk group, sorry, 2 townsfolk groups in the distance. Looks like another townsfolk group in the foreground. The game is played by the square, so buildings can be moved around. But of interest here were the 3D printed buildings, which are awfully nice. These are townsfolk groups again, with short shooters, which means you only have a range of 1 square. They can be outdistanced easily by long shooters. However, their survival rate in the buildings is actually very good. Troops have to get in amongst them to try and really sort them out. I can see a group of cavalry on the right hand side of the building there, and an old Airfix Fort Apache in the background. The cacti represent just partial cover. Partial cover could be bits of fences, old wagons, whatever. The mat itself is in 6-inch squares, and this one's a Flames of War mat with black spots for every 6 inches, with a few hills by S&A Scenics on the right hand side. Thank you to all the players that took part, that's great. Thank you to Entoyment Store, the staff were very helpful. And also all those present got the special celebration collectible figure as well. So thanks to everybody.